History 1. Craigslist isn't something I often use. I mean, less than once a year for sure. But sometimes it's just the easiest way to sell something that would otherwise be impossible to sell quickly. However, after what happened to me about 3 years ago, I never used Craigslist again. I was 22 at the time, living in a very small house with a roommate. We'd been there for over a year before he moved out. The lease was ending in a few months anyway, and without a roommate to split the rent, I couldn't afford the place anymore. So I had to move out too. Finding an apartment wasn't too hard, but it was way smaller than the house, which meant I had to get rid of most of my furniture. The couch was practically unused. My roommate and I had bought it just over a year ago when he moved in. It seemed like a waste to just put it out on the street for someone to pick up. The thing was expensive, and I could really use the extra money for the move. So, I resorted to Craigslist. This was my first time ever selling anything on the site. I'd always been the one buying stuff. I'd never had any weird experiences aside from the awkward feeling of being in someone else's house and meeting a stranger. Being the seller this time, I felt more comfortable since I'd be at my house. It took over 2 weeks for someone who was seriously interested to reply to the ad and ask to check it out. He ended up calling me to ask a few questions about it. Honestly, it made me feel better, as I assumed he was just trying to be safe and make sure I wasn't some creep. His name was Jack, and he told me he had just moved into a new house and needed some cheap furniture to fill the space. I mentioned that I was in the opposite position, moving from a house to an apartment. He politely asked why I was leaving, and I told him that my roommate had left so I couldn't afford the place anymore. He sounded nice, which I guess made me tell him more than I should have. We set a time for both of us after work on a Saturday evening around 6. When the time came, I left the front door open and waited. I sat on the couch for over an hour, waiting for the guy to show up. Eventually, I shut the front door and went to the kitchen to make some food, assuming he had bailed on me. But then the doorbell rang a few minutes later. It was 7:30 at this point, so I was a bit upset, but I tried to fake a smile and opened the door. "I'm Jack," he said, holding out his hand for a handshake. He was a tall, larger man with a big grin. I shook his hand and invited him inside, showing him the living room. He looked at the couch, nodding in approval. Then I heard footsteps outside the front door, followed by it opening, and 2 more men walked in. "Sorry, these are my buddies moving in with me. Hope you don't mind." "Oh, yeah, that's fine," I said nervously, knowing there wasn't much I could do about it. I was starting to get uneasy and had a bad feeling in my gut. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was overthinking, but my feelings wouldn't go away. Jack walked to the other side of the couch and knelt down as if inspecting something. Then he stood up. "What's this over here?" he said, pointing at the side of the couch with the other 2 men standing behind me. I reluctantly walked over to where he was and looked down at the couch. "I don't see anything." He pointed again, wanting me to get down and look. The 2 other men came closer, standing in front of me while Jack was behind me. Slowly, I knelt down and looked at the side, still not seeing anything. I could feel all of them breathing over me, making me feel powerless and terrified. "I'm just messing with you, there's nothing there," Jack exclaimed, giving me a hard pat on the back as I stood up. I let out a nervous chuckle and moved a few steps away. The other men had creepy smiles on their faces as they looked at Jack, as if plotting something. I tried to remain calm and think of a way out, but they were in my house. I couldn't just leave, and I was too scared to ask them to go. "So, do you like it?" I asked, trying to speed up the process. Jack looked at his friends and then back at me. His happy, smiling expression had shifted. There was an odd moment of silence as I stared into Jack's empty eyes, a calm before the storm. One of the men tackled me to the ground, pinning me down aggressively. My instant reaction to resist was overpowered by his strength, and I gave up quickly, hoping not to be further harmed. Jack and the other man ran through the house, looting everything valuable, creating chaos and mess in all the rooms. The man on top of me continued to hold me tightly, pushing my head into the hard wooden floor with all his weight. After a few minutes, Jack called out by the front door, and the man got off me and ran out of the house. I heard their truck pull out and speed off as I lay on the ground in shock, pain, and terror. After a couple of minutes, I gathered myself and slowly stumbled to the front door to close and lock it. I called the cops soon after. To no one's surprise, Jack wasn't his real name, nor was the email or phone number attached to any identifiable person. They collected some fingerprints around the house and took pictures of their shoe prints, but the case ran cold with no suspects at all. The only thing they identified was that the shoe prints left at my house matched those at someone else's house a few weeks ago during a similar attack and robbery. That person was also alone in their home. It's suspected that they target those who live alone. So I kind of screwed myself by telling Jack about my roommate who had left. Either way, that experience has caused me a lot of stress and anger. I was blinded by the feeling of safety in my own home and was taken advantage of. Sites like Craigslist are dangerous, and people need to be more aware of the dangers of inviting unknown, seemingly innocent people into their homes. History 2. I tried buying a truck off Craigslist some years back, and before you say anything, it was a great price and I wasn't in the best financial situation. I'd never actually used Craigslist before, but I knew it was a common place for folks to sell their stuff, which meant it was usually cheap. Even with the low prices of cars on the site, I still had to ask my dad for money because I didn't even have a few $1,000s in my account for a cheap car. After a bit of scrolling, I messaged this guy who posted his truck for $4,000. He got back to me pretty quickly, answering all my questions and giving what sounded like honest answers. He basically said that it wasn't the nicest looking, but it would get you where you gotta be reliably. Interested, we agreed to meet at a Burger King that was a halfway point between where we both lived. I got there first, taking an Uber, and he showed up maybe 5 minutes later. We chatted for a bit and he told me more about the truck, mentioning minor issues it had given him in the past, but nothing too serious. After all, I didn't have the money to be picky. Of course, I asked if I could test drive it, to which he said that he knew a less busy parking lot where I could test drive it. Honestly, I was like, all right, whatever, and I took my phone out to get a quick Uber, but he said it was just across the street and that we could just ride together. I didn't want to be rude and had never done something like this before, so I kind of assumed it was a normal thing. Looking back, I should have told him to buzz off, but I was young and he was old, so for some reason I trusted him. As I got inside, he asked me if I had my license on me, which was just another reason I trusted him. He seemed like a genuine guy. He started driving, though we went a little further than across the street, probably a few blocks away from the Burger King to this empty parking lot away from the main road, which was the first red flag, even though it should have been the second or third. All right, let's switch, he said, putting the car in park. As we were passing each other around the car, he threw me the keys, saying, "Heads up." But they landed nowhere near me. I mean, I would have had to dive onto the concrete to catch them. Awkwardly, I went to pick them up, and just as I bent down, I felt the weight of his foot slam against my side. Before I knew it, he was on top of me, ripping my wallet out of my back pocket and running back towards the truck. I immediately grabbed the keys from the ground, thinking he must have forgotten them in the heat of the moment and that I could possibly force a trade. Unfortunately, the keys he threw at me must have been fake because he just drove away, leaving me stranded there stupidly. What makes everything worse is that it all happened so fast I couldn't even get the darn license plate. I still had my phone though, and the first thing I did was cancel the only card I had because I couldn't risk him spending money I didn't have. And then I called the police. I walked back to the Burger King and filed a report when they met me there, but with only the description of a rusty white truck and an average middle-aged white guy. Nothing ever came of it. He took the ad down, and his email wasn't even a real name. Apparently it was just named after a video game character. And again, I didn't get his plates, so all in all, I lost $4,000 of straight cash, had to wait for a new card in the mail, had to get a new license, and they didn't even catch the guy. Moral of the story is, don't use Craigslist, and don't be as stupid as I was. History 3. I used to work for a big maid company, but left after my ex-coworker Sarah told me she was making more than triple just working by herself and listing ads on Craigslist Marketplace. Naturally, I looked into it and eventually began doing that as well. For nearly 7 months, I made amazing money before anything weird happened. I've never encountered someone that creepy since, and hope I never do again. I had answered a typical email from someone asking me to clean their house. The way it works is they tell me what rooms they want cleaned, and I charge the price based on how long I think it will take. To do this, I either go to their house to make an estimate, or they can send me a video walkthrough. This is the way we did it at my old company, except I charge a much better price and people feel more comfortable with the same person coming over every week. The man, whom I'll call Mr. Johnson, had sent me a video walkthrough of his house, and it was already quite clean, which happens with a lot of clients who just want to maintain that cleanliness and have someone get the nitty-gritty. We set a date and time, and a few days later, I went for the first cleaning. I was going to be there for about 3.5 hours, doing the top and bottom floor, no basement, and giving extra care to the kitchen and bathroom tiles. Mr. Johnson greeted me at the door and led me upstairs so I could work my way down. This is where everything went south. I began cleaning, expecting him to leave, but he just stood there watching me. Sometimes older women who are control freaks do that, but this guy wasn't looking at what I was cleaning. He was eyeing me. I asked him if he wanted me to do anything else, and he just stood there for a second. Then he said, "You know, when I saw your ad on Craigslist, I knew I had to have you." At first, I didn't think of this in any kind of flirty way. I just saw this as some older white guy telling me, a Mexican woman, that I was meant to be good at cleaning. I didn't really care. I've heard it all the time. They usually just say things out of ignorance. But I wanted the money, so I kept my mouth shut and faked a response. "Oh, well, thank you. I usually ask that people stay out of the room, though. It's just easier to clean that way." He said, "No problem." But clearly there was, because while he left that room, he went to the room just across the hallway and sat on the bed, watching me from there. At this point, I was getting creeped out, and the thought of him watching me for 3.5 hours was very unsettling. I had an idea. After I dusted, I started to vacuum behind the door so I could move it, leaving it only slightly open so that for the rest of this room at least, he wouldn't be able to look at me. I just had to get through this day, get paid, and never come here again. I moved to the bathroom that was connected to the room. I was about 20 minutes in, scrubbing grout, when I felt that I was being watched again. I turned around and sure enough, he was there in the doorway. "Sorry to bother you," he said. "I forgot to tell you to leave the vanity as is. It was my wife's. She died years ago in 2009. It's been really rough going through all that, so I want to preserve it." I said, "Okay," and after a moment of silence and awkward staring, he finally left. I wondered why he didn't just put in special instructions to not touch the master bathroom vanity if it was so important. But as I was cleaning around it, I noticed some makeup on the counter that I knew had only come out a few years ago. This was 2017, and he said his wife died in 2009, but the makeup on the counter had a few products that came out no earlier than 2015. I knew this because I was excited when they came out. For what it's worth, if this vanity had been preserved, it would have looked a lot worse. If I wasn't sketched out before, I definitely was now. Thankfully, for the rest of the time I was upstairs, he didn't look at me or talk to me. I was dreading going downstairs, but I was halfway done and just needed to get the rest of it over with. I got to the kitchen and started there. From the kitchen, you could see the living room, and again something was off. This guy had 0 pictures hanging up. I've cleaned so many homes, hundreds at this point, and I've never seen a house with no pictures. Even people who lived alone had at least holiday cards of other people's families on their fridge. I don't know why it freaked me out so much, but it did. Right when I decided I was just going to do the rest really fast and cut some of the cost for him, he appeared in the archway and asked if I could do him a favor. I hesitantly asked, "What?" He said he knows it specifically says no basement, but he forgot he's having guests over next week, and that's where the pool table and everything is. He just wants it quickly vacuumed. I told him I was on a really tight schedule and wasn't sure if I could do it today, but maybe next time. He then said I could skip the dining room because it's never in use and just do the basement floors instead. I explained that I could come back tomorrow and do the whole basement instead of just the floors if he wanted, just trying to push it off a little bit. This was when his whole demeanor changed. He started to get really weird and said that he just wants the floor done and couldn't understand why I wouldn't just do it today. He went on to say that he and his wife really needed the floors done down there. His wife, the one that had died years ago. That was the moment I realized this guy was clearly trying to do something horrible, but I didn't know what. I told him, if I have time, I will. Well, can I just show you what needs to get done down there? It won't take long, just really quick, he said. Knowing he wasn't going to stop, I pretended to get a phone call, so I went to the other room. I then called my friend to explain what was happening. He was still watching me carefully, so I spoke in Spanish, praying he didn't know any. She agreed to drive to this address and make sure when I left, he didn't try to follow me or worse. I got off the phone and told him that I had a family emergency and could come back tomorrow to finish everything, which was obviously a lie. He looked at me with the coldest look on his face and replied, "Don't DJ bother." Then he walked upstairs while I gathered my things. I knew I wasn't going to get paid, but at this point I just felt lucky to leave. My friend got there while I was loading my trunk, and the guy was staring at me through the window the entire time. I left, and when I got home I called the police to tell them what happened, but there wasn't much they could do since he didn't break the law. He was just being creepy. They basically just told me the obvious to not go there again, which I clearly wasn't going to. Just a reminder for everyone, if you provide a service through sites like Craigslist, there is no sure way to tell who's weird and who's not. So make sure to trust your gut and always let someone know the address you VDJ-TMR are going to, and when you VDJ-TMR is supposed to leave, just in case. I don't know what was wrong with that guy or what he had planned for me in that basement, but I hope nobody else has to find out.